It's May 10, Ukraine Media Center confirmed continuous its operation. My name is Svetlana Chaparenko, and now we will be talking about the condition of Ukrainian power grid after the fifth combined drone and missile strike inflicted by the Russians. Joining us today is Volodymyr Kudrytskyi, chairman of the board of NEC Ukrenergo. Good afternoon, Mr. Volodymyr. Good afternoon. So the enemy has resumed the combined strikes on our power grid. There were some significant damage of the power grid facilities. So can you please tell us what is the situation for the time being? Well, the scale of the attacks is equal or even bigger than the one during the season of the years 22-23, specifically in terms of application of loitering drones, the number of which has obviously grown in the reserves of the enemy. And talking about the generation facilities, it increased the scale of last year's damage. This is why there is currently a deficit in the power grid that arises during the hours of the consumption peaks in the morning and in the end of the working day. And now we strongly depend on the imports of the electric power and emergency aid engaged by the Ukrenergo on top of the imports. And due to the fact that during the night hours the import is non-existent, we have deficit during those night hours, and the last resort to balance the power grid under current conditions of lack of import is the restriction of consumption. Currently, Ukrenergo uses this restriction for non-utility users, for industry and businesses. It happens because of the specific procedure, and during different conditions, under different conditions, different schedules are used. When the deficit arises a couple of times per day and those hours are limited to certain hours, the special schedule of rolling power shutdowns for non-utility users is applied, because there's a lot of questions. Why isn't the utility user restricted? Because is the specific procedure based on which we identify both format and the sequence of such restrictions. Also, it's worth mentioning that the emergency aid that we engage when the imports cannot cover this interstate section, or when it's not fully drawn by the Ukrainian market to cover the deficit in the system. So this emergency aid is not guaranteed, and it's only provided in case our neighbors have the excess of power, excess of capacity that they can share with Ukraine. Given the fact that we request such aid quite frequently, it happens so that sometimes we are being refused, or sometimes such aid comes in a limited amount. This is why we see a necessity to stabilize the commercial import that is the stable source of electric power for our power grid, and we want to use it to avoid the necessity to resort to emergency aid. And there is quite an interesting peculiarity of today's regulations, which means that those industries that fall under restriction, if they import the electric power for themselves, and if they cover at least 30% of their consumption with imports, today's rules would guarantee the absence of shutdowns for them. This is why I'm urging the industries who fall under such restrictions from time to time to take care about their consumption, using the imports. Thus, they will help themselves to avoid the shutdowns, but in the same way, they would support the power grid, because if we replace the emergency aid with imports, first of all, it's cheaper, and after that is the guaranteed source of supply of electric power to the power grid. We understand that currently the situation is one of the most difficult, but not maximum difficult, because we haven't witnessed the real summer heat so far. Our users do not use the air conditioning just yet, but at the same time we understand that during summertime the resource of hydraulic power plants is lower, specifically during hot days, and respectively the capacity of nuclear power plants has not reached its minimum. And definitely we will be witnessing some challenges in the summer related to the deficit of capacities due to the damage of the power plants. And talking about the mainway networks, the grid operates without any restrictions, save for the Kharkiv region where the restrictions are still in place, and the Kryvyi Rih district where there is a restriction in place for the industrial consumers. Over there, those restrictions are related not only to the fact of attacks over the power grid, but also it's related to the fact that the enemy inflicted significant damage on the local generation capacities. So it's a double effect: the attacks on the networks that carry the power to the grid, and the attacks on the local generation that was generating electric power for that region. But again, I would like to mention that such network restrictions, for example, as the one existing in Kharkiv, where the utility consumers fall under the restrictions, so all those restrictions will be lifted soon. I have to always make this remark that in the absence of any new attacks. So I think that even today we will be able to switch Kharkiv to the mode in which all of the regions of a country operate. Well, that's great news for Kharkiv, specifically given the current conditions. Well, there are many talks about raise of tariffs for electric power to compensate the losses. What is the reasonable price? What is the financial situation of Ukrenergo upon the results of upon those massive combined drone and missile strikes? Well, definition of tariff is not a responsibility of our company. Our task, saying roughly, is to provide everybody with light and to provide everybody with a stable supply of the electric power, to make sure that our system works in integral manner and is connected to Europe. This is why any changes of tariffs for the utility consumers is not something that I can comment, and on top of that, I would not like to create any distortion of information in the information space using the tariff talks. So I hope there's enough commenters online on top of me. So we prepared a small presentation just these days on the website of London Stock Exchange. Us as the issuer of Eurobonds, we've published our IFRS financial reports, and the main parameters for year 23 are as follows. Our income is 83 billion hryvnia. The revenue was 83 billion. The income is 400 million that we've obtained, even despite the fact that in year 23 there were significant damage of our power grid, and also our financial results were affected by devaluation of hryvnia against foreign currencies, because a lot of our debt is denominated in foreign currencies, is either in US dollar or euro. That implies a additional costs. But even given the necessity of the highest scale repair campaign in our history, we were still able to make some small but still income. What's important that we were able to repay more than 24 billion hryvnia of debt in front of our lenders. You know, there is the whole chain of debt, like Ukrenergo is in debt of 56 billion and our debt is 38. We achieved this difference thanks to the successful work of our organization with the international financial organizations, and to the fact that thanks to our reputation we were able to raise donor funds for restoration of the grid, but also to repay our debts in front of our lenders, and those funds were spent to repair the power plants who got the available financial resources for restoration within the first quarter of the year 24. So it's a very important function when we, thanks to the reputation, are an organization, or we can serve as the organization that can raise financial resources and hand it over to the sector for restoration of all of the members of the market. We've also paid 2.4 billion hryvnia of dividends and taxes to the government, which we think is quite a good result. Also, what's important is that thanks to our capability to raise grant funds for restoration of our damaged power plants and to build the new power lines, our assets have grown in price. This year, Deloitte assessed the value of our assets, and in fact, the cost of assets have grown 45 billion hryvnia, which is confirmed by the independent evaluator, which means that the asset of the government of the country of Ukraine, such as Ukrenergo, has grown in price even regardless the massive strikes of the enemy, and it demonstrates the way we work to increase the price of our asset, the value of our asset for the government, which will allow us to raise more funding for the power grid of Ukraine in future. And next slide, please, or you can switch it by yourself with the clicker. So talking about the details of the repayment of debt in the market thanks to the auxiliary services, those are the services for the nuclear, hydraulic and thermal power plants, will provided by those plants to the system for short-term balancing. So we've extended 9.5 billion hryvnia. We were able to decrease the debt in this segment of the market way down to zero. And thanks to the renewable power sources, we've decreased this debt to zero. And talking about PSO, those debts were decreased 12.2 billion hryvnia. And in both cases, the debt was repaid thanks to our reputation and our ability to raise funds in the foreign market at cheaper cost. And talking about our cooperation with the donors, we got almost 200 million euro worth of equipment from different donors. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we were able to mobilize financial resources in amount of 1.2 billion euro from different financial organizations, from governments of different countries. And yesterday I had an honor to sign another grant agreement with KfW, German Export Control Agency, with the government of Germany, basically, under which the German government hands over the money to the government of Ukraine for rebuilding of the damaged infrastructure, power infrastructural facilities. And thus we continue to serve as the transit vehicle, efficient transit vehicle, allowing to raise the funds for the sector. And I would like to say that this year we set a task for ourselves thanks to this capability of ours to repay the debt in full on the balancing market. The debt that of Ukrenergo that amounts to almost 19 billion hryvnia for the time being, and the utility consumers in the same market owe more than 32 billion hryvnia to Ukrenergo. What we plan is to repay our debt in front of our lenders in full, down to zero, and thus we may create additional financial resource for our thermal and hydraulic power plants so they restore to the best possible extent and prepare to the new heating season. And in the same way we will clear the way for the new power plants, specifically those that provide the balancing services, so that they can operate in the balancing market, and the investors will get additional stimulus to invest in Ukrainian power grid, so we could build the disseminated generation. And a very practical step that we are going to take this year is repaying the debt in the balancing market thanks to the unprecedented raise of funding for this purpose. Well, basically, that's it on my end with my report, and I'm open to any and all of your questions. Well, so talking about the debt is still existing for the time being. So how does this situation affect the capability of Ukrenergo to restore the damaged facilities? Well, we have two main debt problems. First of all, is the balancing market, and over there 32 billion hryvnias are owed to Ukrenergo by the consumers for the consumed electric power, and it's not yet paid for. And the smaller amount, 19 billion hryvnia, is something that we own to the generating facilities. So it's not only Ukrenergo but also the power plants who experience this problem. And the problem of the balancing market is complicating the restoration process, because the financial resources that could be accumulated, they could be used by those companies for the purposes of their restoration, for preparation to winter. And this is why we think that it's important to repay the debt on our end at cost of credit resource and what is owed to us. We understand that it's a long story. Those are the consumers that have this debt for years. Those are the municipal companies, but it's more important to provide resources to the power plants. And another part of the debt is the debt before the guaranteed buyer, but now we're down from 36 billion. We've decreased that debt for more than 10 billion within a month. So there is a positive dynamics here, and I think that if we don't get new debt created during this period, we will end this year with the debt in amount of about 15-16 billion. Well, we're not going to be able to cover all of the debt, to repay all of the debt, because we focus on the balancing market. But even for the renewable power generating capacities, we try to cover it for them. But again, 95% of all those funds that were necessary to restore our infrastructure, 95% we raised as donor funds or loans. So all that program was mostly financed by donors. That's again our important capacity, we don't overload the consumer with billions and billions of hryvnia that we would need to raise to restore our capacity, to restore it after damage. So thanks to those sources, we were able to renew our power grid almost to the full before those attacks that started from the 22nd March this year. In fact, we renewed almost everything, and we've ordered all of the necessary equipment to make sure that the mainway network operates in a proper way. And now, against that new damage, we're ordering more equipment to make sure that we avoid any situations when we're missing some of the equipment. So we have quite a positive outlook with regard to the operation of the power grid, and I think that's safe for the cases when Russians focus on some city, for example, where they can create some local problems. Generally, the mainway network was working, is working, and will continue operating in a stable way. Thank you, dear journalists. Do we have any questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Vladislav Obuch, Ukrinform. You've mentioned that Ukrenergo is trying to order the equipment beforehand to restore the power grid. So I would like to ask you to give more color whether all those reserves that were procured previously were used. Is the equipment sufficient? Is there any reserve for current restoration? And what is your attitude to the idea of search of the equipment that was already used? Because we know that manufacturing of new equipment may take months or even longer. Like, for example, as it happened in the case of old Latvian thermal power plant that is handed over to Ukraine currently. Well, more than a year ago, we started getting the used equipment, transformers from Lithuania, Germany. So this practice is not only not new for us, but I would say that it's quite a usual practice for the time we've been. In the years 22 and 23, back then in that heating season, when the Russians started focusing their strikes on our power grid, we only had that reserve that was created by Ukrenergo back then. Nowhere in the world, apart from some specific pieces of equipment that could be deinstalled from some power plants and to be moved to Ukraine. So that heating season, we went through it using our own reserves. But back in November and December year 22, we've ordered the record number of transformers and other high voltage equipment that started coming to Ukraine in the middle of year 23, and it continues coming to Ukraine gradually. So we've created such a mobile reserve when every month certain amount of transformers and other types of equipment is coming to Ukraine. And thanks to that, we were able to create certain reserve. And basically, we feel quite confident in case of any new strikes, any new damage, we would be still capable to mitigate this damage thanks to the reserve of the equipment. And it was already demonstrated in such regions as Kharkiv region, Odessa region, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk region. I'm just giving examples of the regions that were actively attacked with missiles and loitering drones within the last 2.5 months. So again, there is reserve in place. We continue ordering new equipment, and we will continue doing that as long as the risk of strikes on our power grid persists. Thank you very much. Another question. Let me read questions sent by our colleagues who are watching us online. So Argos Media, can you please name the reason why the industry gets restrictions in the night and in the evening? So evening is the time of the peak consumption, and in the night commercial import is not coming to Ukrainian power grid, and despite by the fall of consumption in the grid. At the same time, the available resource is decreased because the import is not available in the night. So we cover it with the emergency aid where we can, but again, we cannot do it 24/7, so we have to apply those restriction schedules. Another question, given the situation in the system and the plant maintenance in the nuclear power plants, can we expect the restrictions to continue existing all summer long? If there will be increase of the deficit in the power grid, if the deficit will be uninterrupted within a day, another schedule is used in the system, is the rolling power shutdown schedule, is when Ukrenergo provides the limit of consumption for every region, and Volodymyr, in coordination with the military administration, they distribute the available limit for every consumer, creating the rolling power shutdown schedule. So basically, if the deficit deteriorates, the schedule, the existing schedule will be not enough, and then we will have to resort to another schedule that will contemplate the restrictions for all categories of users. Two questions from Forbes. So during which period the electric power is available in sufficient amount in the grid, and what is how different is the situation in Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv? Situation in Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv is the same because the power grid works as the integral organism, no matter where the consumer is, save for some specific cases that I've mentioned where the capacity is not enough in the power grid, like in Kharkiv, that, as I've said, in Kryvyi Rih district. In all other regions, the situation is absolutely the same because the power grid works as the one body. So what hours are the best for consumption? Well, it's natural that in spring, when the sun is active, such hours are day hours from 12 to 3-4 p.m. when there is a peak of solar activity, and the solar power plants, they cover that deficit that we observe in the morning and in the end of the working day, and this specific deficit in the night. Another question from Forbes. So there is a procedure when first the businesses and then the population are restricted. Is there any initiative for review of this procedure, and what body is in charge of approving such procedure? Well, currently the review of this procedure is under discussion. There is a reason the restrictions are applied in this sequence. It happens because when there is a necessity to disconnect and to reconnect some consumers during the day, when the deficit just arises during specific hours during the day, it can be physically impossible to disconnect millions of consumers and to reconnect them, because it influences the wear of the equipment and it's technically complicated. So when this deficit schedule is unstable, when it's not integral, during this time we observe the procedure for disconnection, for the shutdowns of the industrial consumers. But should the deficit grow, we will probably may have to resort to the rolling power shutdown schedule, under which all types of consumers, all of the categories of consumers may be disconnected from time to time. Again, talking about the agency responsible for those procedures, well, the text of the instruction is being created by us, the operator. It's approved by the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine, and it's also approved by the Ministry of Justice, and it's mandatory. Whether the procedure should be amended or not, we will have to observe this, to continue surveying the situation, and I hope that we will achieve bigger numbers of import of electric power, and thus we may be able to minimize those schedules for the industry. The last question from Extra Electricity: to what extent the import capacity from European unions may be increased? Well, there are certain network restrictions on the European side for imports, but conditionally, such an increase of capacity is limited by the capacity of aerial lines or automatic transformers in our neighboring countries, so their replacement, expansion, or upgrade takes pretty long time, and it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I don't expect any radical increase of import, but at the same time, we can periodically, on top of those 1.7 thousand of allowed import, we can engage the emergency aid, which is a normal practice for European operators. We can add 200 to 300 megawatts to add to our power grid. Unfortunately, not always during those periods when we draw all of the commercial imports. Our neighbors have still something that they can share with us as emergency aid. This is why this tool is limited in terms of use by the resources of our neighbors. Nina Vitoska, Interfax Ukraine. Mr. Volodymyr, are there any industrial consumers who took advantage of that import to cover their needs, and why the industry is not disconnected from power supply in Kherson region? Well, Kherson region in fact consumes minimum amounts of electric power. I would not talk about any serious consumption by the industry in Kherson region. So in practice, it wouldn't have any sense. It wouldn't provide any significant effect. But for the region, given the situation the region ended up in, I think it would be quite sensitive and painful for them. Talking about the consumers who take advantage of the import, well, in fact, we have import, which means that such industries exist. It's not the individuals, not the utility consumers who use that import. Those imports are being ordered from the brokers by small businesses, medium-sized businesses. Why don't they use this option in full? I think it's the matter of awareness, first of all, and again, those schedules implemented for the industry during the latest days or weeks, they don't last long enough for the businesses to be able to adapt to the new realities, to this new situation. But I have to say, for the sake of justice, that back in the winter, we were warning the businesses, we were making meetings for them to explain that there will be deficit in the power grid, that it's worth looking for the supplier who can bring this import to the country for some specific facility. And it was even before those massive Shahed strikes, and unfortunately our forecast came true. And I think that now those businesses who were disconnected due to the peculiarities of the technological cycle, I think that it's the most painful for them. I think for them it's worth thinking about booking their consumption, ordering import from European countries. Thank you very much. Another question will be in English, in case you need translation.
Dodson, I'm a U.S. Army veteran, and this is my 5th mission here in Ukraine, and one of the things we've seen is that, generators can become an option when the energy is not available. And I'm wondering if there's NGOs that are organizing so that when you have the rolling blackouts, especially in the winter, that we can match and raise money for generators for folks in these areas that don't have access to energy in the winter.
Could you please specify what is exactly your question?
Are there NGOs that people in the U.S. can support so that we can get generators in the event that there's no energy when there's rolling blackouts? Or
Well, there are numerous NGOs, as far as I know, which are providing generators, but also other types of humanitarian support for people during shortage of electricity supply. They were especially active, of course, during the shellings of last year, but they are still active. And I cannot mention the full list of such NGOs, but I truly believe that if you Google them, you will easily find 5, 10, 15 NGOs in the United States that are providing such an assistance to Ukraine. But also outside of the US, there are numerous NGOs, like in Canada, for example, in Europe, in EU in general. And we were working quite closely with Ukrainian World Council, which also delivered a lot of equipment to Ukrainian citizens and helped a lot to stabilize the situation of certain cities and households during last year's blackouts. So yes, there is a network of such organizations, and they are very helpful. And this is, of course, not mentioning huge support that we received from international organizations of different kinds.
Дякую, пане Володимире, за детальні відповіді. Я нагадаю, що ми говорили про
Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr, for your comprehensive answers. Let me remind you, we were talking about the power grid of Ukraine, about its condition after the fifth combined massive strike of the Russians. Thank you for staying tuned. Ukraine Media Center Ukrenergo will continue its operation on Monday.